In today's video, I'm going to be ranking the novels of Donna Tartt. Now, she might only have 3 books to her name, but every single one of those books is worth reading. So even if your favourite Donna Tartt novel comes at the bottom of this list, don't be annoyed because I do think that all of these are great books that are worth your time. Number 3, The Goldfinch. The Goldfinch is Tartt's most recent novel, published in 2014. It tells the story of Theodore Decker, a young man who lives quite peacefully with his mother in a flat in New York. Everything comes crashing down, however, when they visit an art museum one day and there's a terrorist attack and Theodore's mother is killed. And during the attack, Theo steals a picture of the titular Goldfinch, and this follows him around along with the memory of his mother for the rest of the story. Life goes pretty strangely for Theo from that point on. First, he moves in with the wealthy Barber family, who are the parents of one of his childhood best friends. Then he moves in with his deadbeat father, who was once an actor and now is not much in the father department and a bit of a gambler. While he's with his father, he meets his best friend Boris, and these two embark on a very deep, somewhat homoerotic friendship that is definitely the centre of the novel. As for Theo, things go from bad to worse as he falls into drugs, to drink, and eventually crime, ultimately realising that he's much more like his father than he ever would have wished. So let's start with the positives. As I said, all of these books are great. I gave this book 5 stars, so it's not like this is a bad book by any stretch. So there's a lot of good things still to say, even if I think this is Tartt's weakest book. The main positive for me is the character of Theodore Decker, who is a fantastic character to follow. He's incredibly sympathetic throughout the story, even when he's at his hardest and his worst and his ugliest. There's always something bright within him. You're always hoping that maybe he'll be able to pull himself out of the dark hole that he's found himself in. And that's quite hard to do. Often when you have a character who's going down a dark path, there's a tendency to make them too unsympathetic. But Theo always has some element of lightness, some element of his mother in him. But of course, it wouldn't be much of a novel if it was only Theo who was a good character. Thankfully, the other characters, and especially the relationships they have with Theo, are one of the highlights of the novel. Boris and Theo's friendship, like I said earlier, is the linchpin of the story. There's these homoerotic tones to their relationship, which is quite interesting. We're never really quite sure how that goes, whether it was just something that happened when they were teenagers, or whether there was something more there. Either way, they have a very deep and fascinating relationship that centres the story. It's also quite a tragic friendship, because arguably a lot of Theo's problems come from making friends with Boris. It's part of his descent into chaos. We also have a very interesting relationship with Mrs. Barber, the wealthy mother that Theo moves in with for a while. This is an interesting relationship because Mrs. Barber is, on one hand, portrayed quite coldly when Theo is living with her. But at the same time, she has these moments of kindness towards him, and her relationship is just very ambiguous. You're not sure if she really likes him there or not, and this all becomes more clear later when she returns in the story. But I just thought that was a really well done relationship. It would have been quite easy to have portrayed Mrs. Barber as just a wealthy, distant housewife, and while to some extent she is portrayed that way, Tartt is sensitive enough as a writer to give her more depth as a character, and so you get a much more interesting relationship between her and Theo. There's also one relationship that isn't focused on very much in the novel, and this is Theo's relationship with Pippa, a young girl who also was in the terrorist attack and survived. Pippa appears sporadically throughout the novel, but she is always on Theo's mind because he's in love with her very deeply. And every now and then she'll return into the story, and they have often awkward interactions, and it's pretty clear that this isn't necessarily going to go anywhere for them both. But it's a very deep relationship, and there's a scene where they get together towards the end of the story and finally have a conversation about what happened to them, and it is just one of the best parts of the book for me. I won't spoil it, but I do really enjoy that part. It's a really interesting way of exploring how an extreme traumatic event like that can bring people together but also set them apart. Another character that I thought was really well crafted was Theo's father. Now, deadbeat dads occur a lot in Tartt's novels. In fact, there's a deadbeat dad in every single one of her novels, but in this novel we finally get a more sympathetic look into the deadbeat dad. He's initially portrayed by Theo as just a terrible person. He abandoned his wife and Theo, and that's how we are introduced to the character, but then obviously he has to look after his son after the terrorist attack. And again, at first it seems like he's just a violent, aggressive, horrible person, but he has moments where he is humanised. And also later on in the story, we realise that Theo is maybe somewhat like his father as well. Another great scene is when Boris confronts Theo about this, and basically tells him that he is very unsympathetic towards his dad, that he doesn't try and understand him, and if he did, he'd have a lot more sympathy for him. And I think that was really clever of Tartt to do that, because as I said, in previous novels, the deadbeat dad doesn't really get much of a look in. That being said, there are some issues with the Goldfinch, and that's why I put it at the bottom of this list. For me, the biggest issue is the plot contrivances. There's a lot of shock deaths in this story throughout, and after a certain point, it does just take, some of the believability out of the story. Now, I don't necessarily mind it with respect to, say, the terrorist attack, because it's the instigating event of the story, it is meant to be a shocking event, and it's also very well integrated into the plot. So that's not really an example of a shock death that I'm concerned about. It's more like the shock deaths that we get in stories like Flowers in the Attic and the Dollenganger series, where characters are there one moment, they disappear, and then we just hear that they've died in a very shocking way later on. And it's not a thing that I really enjoy in stories, especially if it's overused, and I think it is a bit overused in this story. There are also other contrivances in terms of specific events happening, certain chance meetings, and while I appreciate that Tartt is riffing off of Dickens with this, I still think as a style of writing it doesn't always work. One of the reasons why it works for Dickens, at least sometimes, is that Dickens writes in this very whimsical, pastoral way in which that sort of episodic craziness sort of works. Whereas this is a much more serious novel, so I'm not sure that style has as much effect here. The final thing that I'll say on the Goldfinch is that I also think it is probably the least distinctive of Tartt's novels. The novel that doesn't really sound as much like it can come from her as her other two books do. Because she's so steeped in Dickens with this book, he really takes over a lot in the story, in the way it's told, in some of the characters which feel very much like pastiches almost of Dickens. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're putting new spins on things, but I also think that that intrusion of her influences does make the novel slightly less distinctive, and it would have been interesting for her to take some of these ideas further and make it her own, as she does in her other novels. But overall, it's still a fantastic story. The contrivances aren't terrible, they're just there and therefore a bit annoying. And while the style is maybe not as Tartt-like as some of her other books, it's still a great style. Dickens is a great writer and she emulates him very well. Number 2, The Secret History. The Secret History begins with its narrator, Richard, revealing to us that he was involved in a murder when he was at university. At university, Richard joined a group of elite students studying Greek under the tutelage of Julian Morrow, a very elitist professor who handpicks his own very small set of students. His students are incredibly privileged and are very much dazzled by being in this elite group. They're all fascinated with Greek culture and are also quite dazzled by their professor, who encourages them to become interested in the Bacchanal, Greek orgies and celebrations of the god of wine and chaos, Dionysus. Unfortunately, this fascination with the god of illusions leads the students down a very dark path. Now, I would imagine that many people would put The Secret History first, and to be honest, I was going to do that initially, but when I really sat down and thought about these books, I decided to maybe be a bit more controversial, but also I think I just decided that actually this book isn't the best book that Tartt has delivered. But one thing I will say is that of the 3 novels, The Secret History is definitely Tartt's most engaging and immediate novel, and a lot of that comes from the fact that it's probably the novel where the plot is most tightly drawn, and really it is all about the plot rather than an exploration of character, which I would say the other 2 are much more character-based than this one. The plot is also fantastic. It's inspired by Greek mythology, and in particular the play The Bacchae by Euripides. It's also subverting a classic murder mystery trope by having the murder revealed at the beginning of the story, and then we see how the murder is worked up to for the first half, and then in the second half we see the aftermath of the killing. This creates a lot of tension, which is not as present in Tartt's 2 other novels. Those 2 novels have moments of tension, but they also have long passages of, maybe some would say meandering, where Tartt is just focusing on characters and atmosphere as opposed to pushing the plot along. And I think that's probably why a lot of people really find The Secret History such a great novel, just because it's so much more engaging. Now, Richard is an interesting protagonist. He is kind of like an intellectual everyman. He enters an elite institution, and in addition to that, he enters an even more elite clique of very privileged students with this very prestigious professor who is very charismatic and interesting. And obviously you're part of this group of elite students, so you start to feel very superior to everyone else, and you feel like you're being let into secret mysteries that no one else knows with this professor and these students. It's almost like a cult. I think what Richard really taps into is this sort of intellectual fantasy that I think a lot of academics have, where it's your knowledge and only you understand the world and you see it in a certain way that the normal people can't see it in. And I think Richard really taps into that desire that people have. And I think the book explores the dangers of this kind of romanticism, of tapping into these forces and these religions and the past in ways without really fully understanding what's going on and it having disastrous consequences. It amuses me actually that people blame the dark academia aesthetic, which is essentially a romanticisation of intellectual life, thinking about living in Oxford and reading by candlelight and all of this ridiculous stuff. And it's funny that people associate this with Tartt's novel, and actually some reviews of this book say that it is actually endorsing this kind of elitism and this intellectualism. But to me, that's not what the book is about at all. That's what Richard wants, and that's what the characters want, but quite clearly in the story, they all suffer for this. They all follow this dream, and ultimately it shatters all of them. Their prestigious professor goes from being a charismatic, wonderful man to just being a narcissistic, horrible person who leaves them in the lurch. The Secret History seduces the reader, playing on those intellectual desires that we all have, and then shatters them by revealing its consequences. So with all these great things to say, why doesn't this have the first place spot? Well, it is hard to criticise the novel because I do think it is near perfect as a book, but I would say that I do think the second act drags quite a lot in comparison to the first act. It's kind of like a Wuthering Heights situation. In Wuthering Heights, you have this first act which focuses on this very dynamic relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine, and then Catherine dies, and then we have the second act which focuses on the next generation and Heathcliff's revenge, and while still engaging, it just lacks the fire of the first act. And I feel like that's similar here. We have a first act that's building up to the murder, and we see it coming, and we're speculating and wondering how it's all going to happen. And then the second act, the murder's been done, there's still a lot of tension in the aftermath, but it just goes on a little bit too long, and I don't think it quite maintains the same tension that the first half has. I'm also somewhat unconvinced by Richard as a character. I see what Tartt is getting at with this character, as I've explained, but I do find him and his motivations not necessarily very well drawn. He just falls into this clique too quickly and is too willing to accept some of the darker elements of what they're doing, and so he doesn't fully convince me as a character. And I also find that because the story is maybe more plot focused, he just doesn't have the same really 3D dimension to him that Tartt's other two protagonists do. And so for those reasons, I think the book is held back a little bit. That's not to say that Richard is a bad character though, I just don't think he's as strong as the other protagonists, and the secondary characters in this book are all fantastic. So there's still a lot to love about The Secret History in terms of characters. Number 1, The Little Friend. Harriet is the youngest daughter of the Dufresnes family. The family is haunted by the murder of their eldest child, Robin, who was found hanging from a tree not far from the family home on Mother's Day. Harriet was a baby at this time, and the story picks up properly 12 years after this event. Harriet's mother and father are both completely absent due to the trauma of this event, and Harriet is mainly raised by her 3 very eccentric, very fantastic aunts. Harriet develops a fascination with this mystery that shrouds her family, and slowly she becomes to think that she might be able to solve the murder and perhaps restore some order to her family. Tartt described this book as a frightening, scary book about children coming into contact with the world of adults in a frightening way, and I think that is a perfect description of this book. The Little Friend has a very creepy Southern Gothic vibe to it, and it permeates the story throughout, and there are some truly harrowing scenes. Without doubt, this is definitely Tartt's scariest novel. It's also usually regarded as her weakest novel by critics. It was seen as a massive disappointment when compared to The Secret History at the time, and it didn't win the Pulitzer Prize like The Goldfinch did. But I do think that the critics and the public were wrong to sleep on this book. In my view, I think it's Tartt's most distinctive story, her deepest story, and probably her most powerful too. It just takes a bit more work than the other two. I think this novel is probably underappreciated in part because of the immense commercial success of The Secret History. That book was such a literary moment, it sold so many copies, and I think even if Tartt's second book was The Goldfinch, it probably would have been seen at the time as a bit of a letdown. It doesn't help that Tartt, I think, teases the reader by suggesting a murder mystery again and then completely misdirecting the reader, and the story becomes something else, this story focusing on character and this child and her family. And so I wonder if a lot of people are just irritated by the fact that they were expecting The Secret History number 2 and got something else. But at the end of the day, Tartt didn't want to create the same book twice, and she wanted to do something so unlike the first novel and make something that maybe is not as commercially appealing, but actually maybe is a better book. The Little Friend is a very slow-paced story, and that is often what one of the main criticisms of the story is. It's just so meandering. It teases a plot at the beginning, but really it focuses on character. And while the Dufresnes' family is all part of it, Harriet is definitely the centre of the novel. She's one of the best child protagonists I've ever read. Tartt manages to create a child character who is, believably a child. She's naive in certain ways, she has childish interests, but she's not a cliché of childishness, which is really quite hard to do. Harriet is a very deep character. She's had this very tough family past behind her, and she has to navigate this, and so it makes her unlike your usual child. She's insightful and deep, but then she also is still naive and makes mistakes, and this is something she learns as the story progresses. She really believes that she'll be able to be a Nancy Drew and solve the mystery of her brother's murder, but at the end of the novel, the mystery is left completely unsolved. Again, another unsatisfying part of Tartt's novel, perhaps, for those readers who are hoping for The Secret History Part 2. But this is a really important lesson that Harriet learns. She learns that she's not the protagonist in some epic story. She's just a girl growing up with all of this terrible stuff happening, and she has to find some way of finding her way in the world. The book also just paints a very vivid depiction of Southern life, or at least it seems to me, having never lived in the South or been to the South of America. But whether it's the humid, barren atmosphere, her depiction of poverty and the difficulties in class warfare between, poor white people and poor black people and how that works, or whether it's the matriarchal depiction of family life with Harriet's three aunts, that really is one of the selling points of the story. The world Tartt creates here is just so vivid, and I can still feel the atmosphere of this book, even though it's a long time since I read it. I also find this to be Tartt's most distinctive book. The Goldfinch, as I said, is steeped in Dickens to the point where Tartt, she's still certainly got her own distinctive style, but Dickens kind of gets in the way a bit. And The Secret History is steeped in Greek mythology, and Tartt's style is still very much there in that book. But with this book, it's not really obvious what Tartt's immediate influences are in the way that it is with those two other books. It feels like the one book that only she could have written. I don't know how much she was drawing on personal experience for this story or not, but whatever the case, she just creates her own world, and it really shows in the characters, in the writing style, and just the whole thing. All of this said, when I read The Little Friend at the time, I certainly didn't peg this as my favourite Tartt novel, and despite these praises, at the time I did find that it was quite rambling and unfocused. But I think this just came from, like many readers, a misunderstanding of the plot of The Little Friend. It's not that The Little Friend doesn't have a plot, its plot is the characters. It's the psychological development of Harriet moving through the world that drives everything that happens, rather than the external plot, which is something that happens to her. And I think once I realised this and thought about it, I realised that even the rambling parts of the story make perfect sense. And it gave me a much more satisfying view of the novel, especially at the end. So that's it for my ranking of Tartt's three novels. Let me know down in the comments if you've read all of Tartt's books. What do you think of them? In particular, what do you think of my maybe controversial putting The Little Friend first? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra!